Hi everyone, I'm Paula and welcome to Sew Spark Studio. So recently I've been working on a quilted wall hanging that I'm going to put in my sewing studio, and I've decided I want to do a flying geese border around it. So I need 80 flying geese squares. So I thought, what can I do with that for my channel? Well, what do? You try some different methods is what I'm going to do. So I have 3 methods. Now there's lots of ways to do flying geese, and I'm just going to try out 3 of them. So the first one, I'm going to just use my regular ruler and cut rectangles and sew them together. And so that'll be the first method. And then the second method, I don't remember buying this. I think I was somewhere and I got this in kind of a grab bag. And so these are templates for making flying geese. So I'm going to try these out and see how they work. And then for the third method, I recently signed up for a workshop with one of my favorite fabric stores. And the instructor was using the Stripology rulers. And I'd never heard of them before, but they've been out there for a while. And so we actually made a flying geese table runner using these rulers. So I thought, well, let's try this out for this quilt as well, because they're kind of a unique ruler and intriguing technique. They're a bit pricey though, I have to say. So that's why, this one, I have these already, right? And then I did buy this, but this might not be something that everybody has or that everybody actually wants to spend the money on. So 3 choices. Let's see how they work. Let's get started. The first method that I'm going to use is called the stitch and flip method. So my border squares are actually not that large. They're going to be, when they're finished, 1.5 inches by 3 inches. And flying geese need to be, whatever the length is, the height is half of that length. So these will be 1.5 inches high and 3 inches wide. So I'm going to need a piece of fabric that is 3.5 inches by 2 inches for my finished piece. So I'm just cutting here the 3.5 inch piece that is 2 inches wide. So there's the background, 3.5 by 2 inches. And then I need 2 squares that are 2 inches by 2 inches. So I've already cut a strip that's 2 inches wide. So then on the wrong side of these pieces, I'm going to draw a diagonal line from corner to corner. And I'm going to start on the one side. You place this on top of each other, and then I'm going to be stitching this diagonal. And then you trim on this outside piece here to 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch. And you could do this on your mat with a ruler, but it's just a small seam, so I can do it just with my eye. And then this is pressed towards the corner triangle, and I'm just going to finger press. But you do need to be careful that you don't stretch this, because it is on the bias, and that can stretch out of shape. And then you take your other piece and put it on the opposite side and stitch on the line that you drew. And then I'll trim this one on the cutting mat. And then press. And then once you've done this, you want to check your size on that. So I want 3.5 by 2 inches. So my 3.5 is good. My 2 inches, I'm a little off here. So I'm not sure if I'm loving this method. I can still use this piece because there's enough there for me to do the 1/4 inch seam. I would just have to remember that it's not accurate. And sometimes when you're sewing like 80 pieces together, which one will I remember that it's not accurate? So I wouldn't say I love this method. There's a variation of this method that uses oversized pieces. In other words, you'd cut it a little bit wider and a little bit longer. And then after you sew it together, you trim it to the measurements that you want. And I have used that method before, and that way you can get a much more precisely sized piece. With this method, if you don't sew really accurately, then this can happen, which is what just happened to me. So even though this was easy to cut the pieces and so on, but not as accurate as I would like. There is wastage as well. You're cutting off these corner triangles. And in the oversized method, you'd be wasting even more because you'd be trimming all the way around as well. However, I would end up with a more accurate block. And if my block was way off, it wouldn't be usable. So something to remember for the stitch and flip method. And we'll see how the others work out. Maybe this is not my method of choice. So for the second method, I'm going to use these Flying Geese templates that I have. And with these ones, you pick the finished size and use that line as your guideline. So I need a straight line on this, and I have just a small piece of fabric. One of the nice things about this method is that I can use quite small scraps in order to make my pieces. And so I know this is a straight edge. Yeah, not quite long enough, so I can use this other edge here. So I'm just going to square this up. And then I want a 1.5 inch by 3 inch finished piece. So I'm going to lay this along this line. And then it squares off the point. So there's my goose piece. And then this other piece, you need 2 of these. So I'm using this other strip, and I need this size right here, 1.5 inch by 3 inches. And because this was a 2 inch strip, it's almost exactly what I need. I'm going to make sure I'm accurate here. So there's that one. And then the other side, I'll just flip this over. And again, this works really well for small scraps. The other method actually works pretty well for small scraps too. I just had to cut rectangles out of it. So let's flip this around like this. A little easier for me than trying to cut over top of my hands. These templates are a little bit thicker than my other rulers, so I find that a little different working with them. So, all right. So I've got 2 triangles. No sewing instructions here. So yeah, this is how it'll be. So right sides together. And I'm going to be doing a 1/4 inch seam here. And then that'll be pressed like that. And same on the other side. So let's go to the sewing machine. So I've switched out to my 1/4 inch foot for this one because that's the seam that I'm stitching. And then I'm just going to finger press again. And then the other side. Now, when I cut this out, I probably did something wrong because I'm pretty sure this flat edge is supposed to be lined up at the top. But if I do that, my right sides together isn't going to work. So we're going to try it this way and see what happens. So this does need to extend here. It would be easier if it was cut right. So the 1/4 inch seam should meet right at this point here when I'm stitching this. And let's go press this. So let's check the size on this one. And there's going to need to be some trimming as well. So 3.5 inches, that's pretty good. And let's look at the 2 inch here. Trim off the tail on this one as well. So, not bad. So my 3.5 inches again is quite accurate, but again on the 2 inch, it's off a little bit over here. And I did sew what I would consider a scant 1/4 inch on this one. So similar problem to the other method, good for small pieces of fabric, but more time cutting actually. I think I probably could have folded this and cut 2 of the triangles at one time, although there would be more wastage if I did it that way. But I think it would take a little longer to cut it because it's much easier to cut rectangles and squares than to be going around the angles that are on these templates. So good for small pieces of fabric, a little bit less wastage because you're not doing the angles depending on how you cut them out. But I'm not sure about the accuracy unless I just don't sew accurately enough for them. So now let's look at the Stripology method. For the Stripology method, when I took the class, they also asked us to purchase this book. And this book does have some quilts in it, but it also gives tips and instructions for how to do the cutting. And it is useful because it has charts that talk about how much fabric to cut for using the ruler. So I'm doing a 1.5 by 3 inch finish size for my Flying Geese. So I'm going to use a 6 inch square of my background fabric and a 4.5 inch square of my geese fabric. And so then I'm going to layer these right sides together on top of each other. And you want to center this on top of the other one as much as possible. And then you're going to place this diagonally. Well, they say you should use a slice in the ruler, so I like to place them on my cutting mat so I can line up the points on the triangle on the mat. And then I'm going to use this first slot in the ruler and get it lined up on that line right here. And then to use this, there are teardrops at each end, and you put your rotary blade into the teardrop, and then there's a slot there and it just guides this along. These rulers also have a non-slip back on them. So sometimes when I'm using my other ruler, I do know that, especially if I'm doing a long cut, it will shift slightly on me, and sometimes it's not so accurate. So this does not move when you're doing your cut. So now I've cut that in half. So I'm going to go and stitch each of these. And then we're going to press each of these towards the background fabric. So now you take these and you place them right sides together and line up the squares so you've got your color against your background on each side, but it is not supposed to line up in the center here. And then we're going to be cutting this using our ruler. Just trying to remember how this gets placed when I do this. So again, you're lining up the points here, and I'm using a line on my mat. And we're going to cut, lining up my ruler, and we're going to cut that again. And now I'm going to go and sew this seam on both of these. I thought I was videoing, but I forgot to press record. So we're going to pretend I didn't do anything, and I'll show you what I did. So you're going to take each one of these, fold them in half, and then you're going to do a snip on the fold, almost to the stitching, but not through your stitching. And do that on both of these. And that is because of how they need to be pressed. You're always pressing towards the background fabric. So below the snip, this one gets pressed this way. And the other side gets pressed the opposite way. And you do that on both of these. Now, the class that I was at, the instructor there said that when you're quilting, you should always press from the right side. And that was news to me. I have never heard that before. I was originally trained, I guess, for sewing clothing, and we were always taught to press on the wrong side. It was really 3 steps. Press as you sew, and then press on the wrong side, whatever direction it needs to go, and then flip it over and press on the right side. But this instructor said you always press on the right side. So I'm going to have to do some research on that, because like I said, I've never heard that before. And does it matter? I don't know. Anyway, as you can see, we're on our way towards making 4 Flying Geese squares all at one time. So now we're going to use our ruler again and do some more cutting. So I have my ruler, and you can actually get these handy little sticker packs to mark your ruler so you don't get confused about where you're cutting. So this one has a really solid center line. I don't think I'm going to mark that. I have a bigger ruler and we marked that one. So on this step, I'm going to make a cut at 1.5. So I can put an arrow there. And then we're doing a cut at 5 inches is the next cut. So this makes it easy to see which slots you're going to be using on the ruler, although I did a lot of cutting without marking it, and it worked. So you're going to put your square so that the background fabric is facing down and up, and your goose fabric is facing to the sides. And then I'm looking at this X in the center here, and this is white fabric, and then there's these diagonal lines here, and I'm lining up those diagonal lines with my block here. And then I'm going to cut on the 1/2 inch line right here. And then I'm going to cut on the center line here. I'm going to cut in the, there's no cut right in the center. There's one to the right of center. So I'm going to cut in that one. I didn't mark that line. Oops. It's sticking, oh, a little static there. You don't need to actually move the square. You're just supposed to move the ruler, but my square moved. It doesn't really matter because now I'm cutting on the other side. So now I'm going to line up this mark on the other side and line that up with my square. This ruler is it's got some static in it. So she said what you can do is just take a damp cloth and just give it a little wipe to deal with that. And then I'm going to cut, see this center line again? I'm going to cut to the left of the center line. And then I'm going to cut on the 5 over here. So that should give me my 2-inch width, which it is. And then you turn these and still lining up those white lines. So now I'm lining up here and I'm going to cut on the 1/2 and the 5. And that should give me my 3 1/2 inch by 2-inch block. And that one is perfectly squared. And then I can do the same with the others. And I would do the same with this one. So you need a little more fabric for this method because you start out with the squares. So some of my small scraps like this don't work. However, I'm getting 4 blocks instead of 1 with this method. A little bit more time doing the cutting, but I don't think that this has taken me 4 times as long to do as it did to do the blocks where I just did a single block. And I love how accurate it is. There is a learning curve with these rulers. I did a workshop and we worked on a quilt there. And so I'm not super experienced with them, but I feel like I understand them. But there is a bit of a learning curve and it's a little awkward, I find. You have to get the blade on your rotary cutter right into the teardrop, and then it will slide right down that groove really easily, and then you take it out on the other side. But I'm wondering about the longevity. I feel like when I'm putting my blade down in there that I'm nicking the edges of the ruler, although what really matters is the slot. And like I said, once you get it in there, it does slide down the slot really easily. The other thing about this is that it is not cheap. Even if you go to Amazon, the prices are very close to what you might pay in a quilting shop. So that is something to think about when you're deciding your method. Conclusions, I guess I would say that it's probably a good idea to have 2 or 3 different methods in your back pocket, so to speak. And then you can pick the method that's going to work with the amount of fabric you have. This is a great method if you want to spend the money on the equipment. And if you do get this, there's all kinds of tutorials online too that show in much more detail than I've done today on how to use these rulers. And I do think they're going to be great when I am cutting strips because you can actually cut multiple strips, and I have a bigger one as well, without moving the ruler. 3 methods, pluses and minuses for each one. And like I said, there are a couple other methods that I've seen online as well, and you might want to try those out too and see what you think. But have fun with them. I'm going to pop up a picture of my finished quilt here so you can see how they look in action, and have a great day.